poor father like you is a disgrace, my daughter, Vivienne said as she threw my belongings into trash bags. She was selling my workshop, calling my antique clocks worthless junk. I felt powerless, watching 40 years of my life's work disappear. But she had no idea that hidden among those dusty timepieces was a 1933 Patek Philippe worth $6 million. What I did next destroyed her perfect world forever, and now she calls me 76 times a day begging for forgiveness. But it's too late. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're listening in the comments. Let me tell you how it all began 3 months earlier in my workshop on Chestnut Street in Salem, Massachusetts. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of my clockmaker's shop, casting long shadows across workbenches cluttered with gears, springs, and timepieces that had witnessed more history than most people ever would. I was Augustus Blackwood, though everyone called me Gus, 68 years old, and I had spent the better part of 5 decades coaxing life back into broken clocks. My workshop wasn't much to look at. The wooden floors creaked with every step, the walls were lined with shelves holding hundreds of timepieces in various states of repair, and the whole place smelled of machine oil and old wood. But to me, it was paradise. Each clock told a story, each repair was a small victory against time itself. That particular morning, I was working on a delicate Swiss movement when I heard the familiar click of expensive heels on my front steps. My stomach tightened. I knew that sound all too well. Vivienne burst through the door like a hurricane in a designer suit, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the morning light. At 42, my daughter had transformed herself into everything I wasn't: wealthy, successful, and utterly ashamed of where she came from. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, not looking up from my work. "You're up early." She wrinkled her nose at the familiar smell of the workshop. "Dad, we need to talk." I set down my tools and really looked at her. Vivienne was beautiful, there was no denying that, but there was something cold in her green eyes that reminded me painfully of her mother. Not the woman I'd fallen in love with, but the bitter person she'd become before the cancer took her. "What's on your mind?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Vivienne glanced around the workshop with obvious distaste. "This place, Dad. It's not sustainable anymore. You're 68 years old, living alone in this dusty old building, surrounded by junk that nobody wants." "These aren't junk," I said quietly. "They're pieces of history. Some of these clocks are over 100 years old." She rolled her eyes. "That's exactly my point. Who cares about old clocks anymore? Everyone uses their phones to tell time. You're living in the past." I felt the familiar ache in my chest that came whenever Vivienne visited. When had my little girl, who used to sit on my lap and listen to the tick-tock of grandfather clocks, become this stranger who saw no value in craftsmanship or tradition? "I'm not ready to give this up," I said firmly. "This workshop is my life." "Your life," Vivienne's voice rose an octave. "Dad, look around you. This isn't living. This is existing. You barely make enough to keep the lights on. You eat canned soup for dinner and wear the same 3 shirts over and over. Meanwhile, I'm trying to build something meaningful, something that matters in the real world." She gestured toward the window where her sleek BMW was parked next to my rusty pickup truck. "I run a marketing firm with 37 employees. I have a penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor. I matter, Dad. But having a father who plays with old clocks in a run-down shop, it's embarrassing." The words hit me like a physical blow. Embarrassing, yes, embarrassing. Her voice was cold now, businesslike. "Do you know what it's like when my colleagues ask about my family? What am I supposed to say? That my father is a 70-year-old man who fixes clocks that nobody cares about." I stared at her, this woman who had once been my pride and joy, and felt something break inside my chest. Not just my heart, something deeper, more fundamental. The bond between father and daughter that I'd thought was unbreakable. "I see," I whispered. But Vivienne wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone and showed me a real estate listing. "I've already talked to a developer. This whole block is being rezoned for luxury condos. They're offering good money, more than this place is worth, honestly." My legs suddenly felt weak. I gripped the edge of my workbench for support. "You want to sell my workshop? I want to help you move into the 21st century," she said impatiently. "There's a lovely assisted living facility in Brookline. Clean, modern, with people your own age. You could finally relax, maybe take up a normal hobby like gardening or reading." The room began to spin slightly. 47 years I'd been in this workshop. 47 years of building something meaningful, of preserving history, of finding purpose in bringing broken things back to life. and my own daughter saw it as nothing more than an embarrassment to be swept away. Dad, Vivian's voice seemed to come from very far away. Dad, are you all right? I tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. The workshop tilted sideways, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the concerned expression on my daughter's face. The first genuine emotion she'd shown since walking through my door. When I woke up, everything would change. But I had no idea that hidden among my collection was a treasure that would turn my world upside down and give me the power to show Vivienne exactly what disgrace really looked like. 3 days later, I woke up in hell. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps casting a sickly yellow glow across peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceiling tiles. The air reeked of disinfectant mixed with something far less pleasant, the smell of forgotten people waiting to die. I tried to sit up, but my body felt like it belonged to someone else. A nurse with tired eyes and coffee-stained scrubs glanced over from her medication cart. "Well, look who's finally awake," she said without enthusiasm. "Your daughter said you might be confused for a while." "Minor stroke," she told us. "Nothing too serious, but enough to make some changes necessary." Changes! The word hit me like ice water. I looked around the cramped room with its single window facing a brick wall, the narrow bed with sheets that had seen better decades, and the cheap plastic furniture that looked like it came from a garage sale. "Where am I?" I croaked, though part of me already knew. "Shady Pines Extended Care Facility," the nurse replied, checking something off on her clipboard. "Your daughter enrolled you yesterday. Said it was for your own good, what with living alone and all." Before I could process this betrayal fully, I heard those familiar expensive heels clicking down the hallway. Vivienne appeared in my doorway, but this time she wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit stood beside her, holding a briefcase, and wearing the expression of someone conducting unpleasant but necessary business. "Daddy, you're awake," Vivienne said, but her voice lacked any warmth. "This is Mr. Patterson, from Patterson Real Estate. We have some paperwork to finish." I struggled to focus as the man opened his briefcase and spread documents across the rolling table beside my bed. The words blurred together, but I caught enough to understand what was happening. "The sale went through this morning," Patterson was saying. "The buyer was very motivated, paid cash above asking price. Your daughter handled everything while you were indisposed." "Sale," I whispered, though I already knew what sale he meant. Vivienne couldn't meet my eyes. "The workshop, Dad. I told you it was for the best. The money will more than cover your care here, and you won't have to worry about maintaining that old building anymore. You sold my workshop while I was unconscious. You had a stroke, Dad. The doctor said you can't live alone anymore. And honestly, after what happened, I realized you were right. This is the best solution for everyone." The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. She had used my moment of weakness, my vulnerability, to strip away everything that gave my life meaning. "What about my clocks?" I managed to ask. "My tools. 40 years have I hired a company to clean everything out." Vivienne interrupted, her voice growing sharper. "Most of it went to the dump, honestly." "Dad, you have to understand, nobody wants old clocks anymore. They're just taking up space." Patterson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The demolition crew starts Monday. The new owners want to break ground on the condo project as soon as possible. Demolition. They weren't just selling my workshop. They were going to tear it down, erasing every trace of the life I'd built there. "I need to go back," I said, trying to swing my legs over the side of the bed. "There are things I need to get. Important things." "Dad, stop." Vivienne's hand was firm on my shoulder, pushing me back down. "Everything's been handled. The building is empty now. There's nothing left to get." But she was wrong. Hidden behind a false panel in my office wall was a safe that contained the most valuable thing I'd ever owned. A 1933 Patek Philippe that my former employer, Mr. Ashworth, had left to me 30 years ago. Vivienne had no idea it existed, and in her haste to erase my embarrassing life, she'd just thrown away $6 million. The irony might have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. Over the next 2 hours, I watched through my small window as trucks arrived at my workshop. Men in hard hats carried out boxes of what Vivienne called junk, timepieces that had survived world wars, economic depressions, and decades of careful preservation. They loaded everything into a massive dumpster, like it was garbage. But the cruelest moment came when I saw them wheeling out my grandfather clock, the first one I'd ever restored the piece that had taught me to see beauty in broken things. They dropped it carelessly, and I heard the crash even through the closed window. 47 years of memories shattered on the sidewalk. Vivienne stood beside the dumpster, checking items off a list with the efficiency of someone disposing of an unwanted inheritance. She never looked up at my window. She never wondered if I might be watching my life's work being destroyed. That night, as I lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of other forgotten souls coughing and crying in nearby rooms, I made a decision that would change everything. My daughter thought she'd won. She thought she'd successfully erased the embarrassing father who didn't fit into her perfect world. She had no idea that hidden in the rubble of my destroyed workshop was a treasure worth more than her entire company. And she certainly had no idea what I was planning to do about it. The old clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, and I smiled for the first time in days. Time, as I'd learned from 40 years of clockmaking, had a way of revealing everyone's true nature. Vivian's time was about to run out. As I stared at the water stain on my ceiling that night, my mind drifted back 30 years to the day that would ultimately save me, though I had no way of knowing it then. I was 38, still learning my craft, working as an apprentice for Elias Ashworth in his prestigious timepiece gallery on Newbury Street in Boston. Mr. Ashworth was everything I aspired to be, a master craftsman who could coax music from the most stubborn mechanisms, a man who understood that clocks weren't just machines, but vessels carrying the dreams and memories of their better owners. He was also dying. The cancer had been eating away at him for months, though he tried to hide it behind his perfectly pressed vests and cheerful demeanor. He had no family, never married, no children, and his gallery had become his legacy, his child, his everything. Augustus, he'd said to me that crisp October morning, his voice weaker than usual. Come into my office. There's something we need to discuss. I found him sitting behind his mahogany desk, looking frailer than I'd ever seen him. But his eyes still held that spark of mischief that made him such a joy to work with. 30 years I've been watching you, he began, his fingers tracing the edge of a small velvet box on his desk. 30 years of seeing you treat every timepiece like it was your own child. Do you know what that tells me about a man? I shook my head, unsure where this conversation was heading. It tells me he understands value, real value. Not the kind that shows up on price tags or bank statements, but the kind that lives in here. He tapped his chest. The kind that can't be bought or sold, only earned. He opened the velvet box, and I gasped. Inside was the most beautiful watch I had ever seen. The case was rose gold, worn smooth by decades of careful handling. The dial was a warm cream color with elegant Arabic numerals, and the hands moved with the precise hypnotic rhythm that only the finest Swiss movements could achieve. Patek Philippe, Mr. Ashworth said softly. 1933. One of only 12 ever made in this particular configuration. I bought it in Geneva in 1952 from a collector who needed money more than he needed beauty. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It's magnificent. It's yours. The words hit me like a physical blow. Mr. Ashworth, I can't possibly. You can and you will, he interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd made his final decision. I have no one else, Augustus. No family to leave it to, no heirs who would understand its significance. But you. You see what I see. You understand that some things are worth more than money. But surely it's worth more than you can imagine, he said with a sad smile. But what good does that do me now? I'll be gone by Christmas, and this beautiful piece will end up in some collector's vault, never to be wound again, never to fulfill its purpose. He closed the box and placed it in my hands. Promise me something, Augustus. Promise me you'll keep it safe. Not in a bank vault or a safety deposit box, but somewhere close. Let it tick away the hours of your life the way it ticked away mine. I promised, though I barely understood what I was promising. Mr. Ashworth died 3 weeks later, and I inherited not just the watch, but a profound understanding of what it meant to be a keeper of time. I installed a hidden safe in my workshop wall behind a panel that looked like part of the original construction. The Patek Philippe lived there for 30 years, wound and treasured, but never displayed, never mentioned to anyone. Not even Vivienne knew it existed. Now lying in this terrible place that smelled of industrial cleaning products and broken dreams, I realized that Mr. Ashworth's final gift might be my salvation. The safe was built into the wall itself. Vivienne's cleanup crew wouldn't have found it even if they'd been looking for it. And with the building scheduled for demolition, I had maybe 48 hours before that $6 million secret was buried under tons of rubble. The next morning I convinced the day nurse that I needed to retrieve some important documents from my old workshop before it was torn down. She was skeptical. Patients weren't supposed to leave the facility without family approval, but I'd been charming women for 68 years, and desperation had sharpened my skills. Just for an hour, I pleaded. There are some papers from my late wife's estate that I need for my insurance. My daughter doesn't know where I kept them. It took 3 buses and a painful walk on unsteady legs, but I made it to Chestnut Street just as the demolition crew was setting up their equipment. The workshop looked like a crime scene, windows broken door hanging off its hinges. 40 years of my life scattered across the sidewalk in garbage bags. But the walls were still standing. I slipped inside through the damaged door, my heart pounding as I made my way to my old office. The panel was exactly where I'd left it, unmarked by the destruction around it. My fingers found the hidden latch, and the safe door swung open with a soft click. There it was, the velvet box, untouched by time or Vivian's purge. I opened it with trembling hands, and the Patek Philippe gleamed up at me like an old friend. Still ticking after all these years, still keeping perfect time, still carrying Mr. Ashworth's faith in my character. As I slipped the box into my jacket pocket, I heard voices outside, the demolition foreman talking to someone about the timeline for destruction. I had maybe 6 hours before this building became a pile of rubble. But I had what I needed now. More than that, I had justice in my hands. Vivian thought she'd stripped away everything that mattered to me. She thought she'd reduced me to a powerless old man with nothing left to lose. She had no idea that her greed and cruelty had just handed me the keys to her destruction. The walk back to Shady Pines felt like a victory march. Every step brought me closer to the moment when my daughter would learn the true meaning of disgrace. Time was on my side now, and time, as any clockmaker knows, is the most powerful force in the universe. 2 weeks after retrieving my treasure, I discovered something far more valuable than any timepiece, a reason to keep living. I had started spending my afternoons at the Salem Public Library, partly to escape the suffocating atmosphere of Shady Pines, but mostly to research the current market value of vintage Patek Philippe watches. What I found made my hands shake with excitement and rage. Similar pieces were selling at auction for between $4 and $8 million, depending on condition and provenance. My watch, with its perfect maintenance and documented history, could easily fetch $6 million or more. Vivian had literally thrown away a fortune when she dismissed my worthless junk. I was deep in these calculations when I noticed him. A young man, maybe 16, sitting at a corner table with a stack of books about horology and mechanical engineering. He was thin with dark skin and intelligent eyes that reminded me of myself at that age, hungry for knowledge and desperate to understand how things worked. What caught my attention wasn't just his choice of reading material, but the way he handled the books. Carefully, reverently, like they contained secrets he'd been searching for his entire life. I watched him for 3 days before I worked up the courage to approach. On Thursday afternoon, he was struggling with a particularly complex diagram of a chronometer escapement, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The problem," I said quietly, settling into the chair across from him, "is that the author assumes you understand the relationship between the pallet stones and the escape wheel. But if you've never seen one in action, the diagram might as well be hieroglyphics." The young man looked up, startled. "You know about watches. I've been fixing them for 47 years, I said with a smile. "What's your name, son?" "Ezekiel," he replied, then added quickly, "Ezekiel Thompson. I'm sorry if I'm bothering anyone. I can move to another table." "You're not bothering anyone," I assured him. "I'm Gus Blackwood, and you're not moving anywhere until you tell me why a 16-year-old is reading about Swiss chronometer movements." Ezekiel's face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm I hadn't seen in years. "I found this old pocket watch in a thrift store," he said, pulling a tarnished timepiece from his backpack. "The lady said it was broken, so she let me have it for $5, but I think it might just need cleaning and maybe a new mainspring." I took the watch in my hands, feeling the familiar weight of quality craftsmanship. It was an Elgin from the 1920s, nothing spectacular but solid American engineering. More importantly, Ezekiel's instincts were correct. It needed maintenance, not replacement. "Where did you learn to diagnose mechanical problems?" I asked. His smile faded slightly. "Nowhere, really. I've been in foster care since I was 8, and I've always been good with fixing things. Radios, bicycles, whatever breaks. But watches. There's something about them that's different. More complicated, but also more. I don't know how to explain it. More alive," I finished for him. "Yes, exactly," his eyes widened. "That's exactly what I mean. Like they have personalities." For the next 2 hours, I explained the basics of watch repair using napkins to sketch diagrams and demonstrate principles. Ezekiel absorbed every word like a sponge, asking intelligent questions and making connections that had taken me months to understand when I was starting out. "Would you like to see this one working again?" I asked, holding up his pocket watch. You could fix it right here, I laughed. Not here, no, but I have some tools back at. Well, I had a workshop until recently. Now I just have a small kit I keep with me. The next day, Ezekiel met me at a coffee shop near the library, practically vibrating with excitement. I had spent the previous evening cleaning his pocket watch and replacing the mainspring with parts I'd salvaged from my destroyed workshop. When I handed it back to him, ticking steadily and keeping perfect time, I thought he might cry. It's beautiful, he whispered, holding it up to his ear. I can't believe it's actually working. That's just the beginning, I told him. If you're serious about learning this craft, I could teach you properly. Not just repairs, but the theory behind it, the history, the artistry. You'd do that. For me. There was something in his voice, a vulnerability that reminded me painfully of my own childhood when I desperately wanted someone to believe in my potential. Ezekiel, how long have you been on your own, officially, since I turned 16 last month? I aged out of the system, but I've been pretty much on my own for years anyway. Foster families don't usually keep kids like me for very long. Kids like you, too old, too smart, too. He shrugged. I ask too many questions. I want to understand how everything works. Most people find that annoying. I felt something shift in my chest, a warmth I hadn't experienced since Vivienne was small and still looked at me like I hung the moon. Not me, son. Questions are how we learn. Over the following weeks, I met Ezekiel every day at the library. I taught him about gear ratios and escapements, about the difference between mechanical and quartz movements, about the great master craftsman who had elevated timekeeping from necessity to art. But more than that, I began to see him as the son I'd never had the apprentice I'd always dreamed of training. He had natural talent, infinite curiosity, and something even rarer, respect for the craft and for the knowledge I was sharing. The moment that changed everything came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. We were working on a particularly stubborn mainspring when Ezekiel looked up from his work and said, almost casually, "Thanks for teaching me all this, Grandpa Gus." The words hit me like lightning. Grandpa, this boy who had every reason to be bitter and cynical, who had been abandoned by every adult who was supposed to care for him, was offering me the title that my own biological grandchildren had never used with any warmth. Ezekiel, I said, my voice thick with emotion, how would you feel about having a real family? He looked up from the watch, hope and fear warring in his young eyes. What do you mean? I thought about Vivienne, about her disgust with my embarrassing life, about her casual cruelty in destroying everything I'd built. Then I looked at this remarkable young man who saw value where others saw junk, who treated knowledge like treasure, who called me Grandpa like it was an honor. I mean, I said carefully that I'm getting old and I need someone to carry on what I've learned. Someone who understands that some things are worth more than money. Are you talking about adoption? The word came out as barely a whisper. I'm talking about family, son. Real family. The kind that chooses to love each other. As Ezekiel threw his arms around me, tears streaming down both our faces, I made a decision that would complete my revenge against Vivienne while giving me something infinitely more precious than mere justice. My daughter thought she had destroyed my legacy by selling my workshop and calling my life's work worthless junk. She had no idea that she was about to lose everything to the very kind of person she'd taught me to value above blood relations. Someone who loved me for who I was, not what I could give them. The wheels of justice were turning, and time was about to teach Vivienne Blackwood the most expensive lesson of her life. 3 weeks after I'd started mentoring Ezekiel, Vivienne's world began to crumble, and she had no idea I was the one holding the sledgehammer. It started with a phone call that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Vivienne was in her corner office at Blackwood Marketing Solutions, reviewing quarterly reports and feeling quite pleased with herself. The sale of my worthless workshop had netted her enough money to expand her business and put a down payment on a vacation home in the Hamptons. She'd even joked to her business partner about finally being free of her embarrassing father and his pathetic clock obsession. That's when her assistant knocked on her door looking unusually flustered. "Miss Blackwood, there's a gentleman here from Sotheby's auction house. He says it's urgent, something about items from your father's estate." Vivienne frowned. "Sotheby's, that's impossible. We already disposed of everything from Dad's workshop. Tell him there's been a mistake." But the man who entered her office didn't look like someone who made mistakes. James Morrison was Sotheby's senior appraiser for vintage timepieces, a thin, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses, and the bearing of someone who dealt in objects worth more than most people's houses. "Miss Blackwood," he began, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I apologize for the unexpected visit, but we have a rather delicate situation on our hands." I'm not sure what you mean, Vivienne replied, though something in his tone made her stomach clench with unease. Morrison opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with documentation. Yesterday we received a call from a demolition worker who was clearing the site of your father's former workshop. Apparently, they discovered a hidden safe behind a false wall panel. Vivienne's blood turned to ice. A safe? That's impossible. I supervised the entire cleanup myself. Nevertheless, Morrison continued spreading photographs across her desk. The safe contained several items of significant historical and monetary value. Most notably this. The photograph showed a watch that took Vivienne's breath away. Even in the picture she could see the warm glow of rose gold, the elegant cream-colored dial, the obvious quality of its construction. It's a Patek Philippe reference, 5096, manufactured in 1933. Morrison explained, his voice taking on the reverent tone of a man discussing religious artifacts. One of only 12 ever made in this particular configuration. We've authenticated it through our Swiss contacts, and the provenance documentation was included in the safe. How much? Vivienne whispered, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Conservative auction estimate $6 to $8 million. Possibly more, given its pristine condition and complete documentation. The room tilted sideways. Vivienne gripped the edge of her desk, feeling like she might vomit. $6 million. At minimum, Morrison confirmed. Miss Blackwood, I have to ask, did you know your father possessed items of this caliber? She couldn't speak, couldn't think. All she could see was herself, 3 weeks ago, standing beside a dumpster, checking items off a list, as workers threw away what she'd called worthless junk. Her father's entire life's work dismissed as garbage, while a $6 million treasure sat hidden behind a wall. The legal situation is somewhat complex, Morrison was saying, though his words seemed to come from very far away. Technically, the safe and its contents were discovered on property that has already been sold. However, since your father is still alive, the question of ownership becomes murky. Still alive, Vivienne repeated numbly. Yes, we've been trying to reach him to discuss the situation. The demolition crew mentioned that he was recently moved to a care facility. We'd very much like to speak with him about his intentions regarding these pieces. After Morrison left, Vivienne sat alone in her office for nearly an hour, staring at the photographs of the watch that represented more money than she'd made in her entire career. The watch that had been sitting in her father's workshop while she'd called him an embarrassment. The watch that had been there while she'd sold his building and thrown away his possessions like trash. The math was brutal and inescapable. She'd spent the last month congratulating herself on finally being rid of her father's pathetic life, while unknowingly destroying a fortune that dwarfed her own net worth by a factor of 10. But worse than the financial loss was the growing realization of what this meant about her father himself. A man didn't accidentally possess a $6 million watch. A man didn't hide such a treasure without understanding its value, which meant that Augustus Blackwood, the poor father she'd been ashamed of, the embarrassing clockmaker she'd dismissed as a failure, had been sitting on enough wealth to buy and sell her company several times over, and she'd thrown him into the cheapest nursing home she could find. Her hands shaking, Vivienne called her assistant. Cancel all my appointments for the rest of the day. I need to go see my father. The drive to Shady Pines had never felt longer. With every mile, Vivienne's panic grew. What if he'd already spoken to the Sotheby's appraiser? What if he knew she'd discovered the watch? What if he was angry about how she'd treated him? What if it was too late to fix this? She burst through the doors of the nursing home like a woman possessed, her designer heels clicking frantically on the linoleum floors. The same tired nurse from before looked up from her medication cart with mild surprise. Miss Blackwood, your father wasn't expecting you today. Where is he? Vivienne demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. Room 12, but Vivienne was already running down the hallway, her heart pounding with a mixture of panic and desperate hope. She had to get to him first, had to explain, had to somehow undo the catastrophic mistake she'd made. She found him sitting by his small window, reading a book about horology, and looking more peaceful than she'd seen him in years. When he looked up and saw her frantic expression, he didn't seem surprised. Hello, Vivienne, he said calmly. I've been expecting you. Those 5 words sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the nursing home's aggressive air conditioning. He knew. Somehow, he already knew about the discovery about the watch, about her panic. Daddy, she began, her voice cracking with desperation. We need to talk. Yes, he agreed, closing his book with deliberate slowness. I believe we do. But as she looked into her father's eyes, Vivian saw something that terrified her more than his potential anger or disappointment. She saw calculation. She saw patience. She saw a man who had been waiting for this exact moment. And for the first time in her adult life, she realized that she might have seriously underestimated Augustus Blackwood. The man she'd dismissed as a powerless old fool was about to teach her that some mistakes can't be undone and some words can never be taken back. The silence stretched between us like a chasm filled with 30 years of disappointment and 3 weeks of betrayal. Vivian stood in the doorway of my cramped room, her perfect composure finally cracking. Her designer suit was wrinkled from her frantic drive, her usually flawless makeup smudged with tears she'd tried to wipe away in the parking lot. For the first time in decades, my successful, sophisticated daughter looked like what she really was, a scared child who'd made a terrible mistake. "Daddy," she whispered, again stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "The man from Sotheby's came to see me." "I know," I replied, not moving from my chair by the window. "I called them yesterday." The color drained from her face. "You called them? Of course I did. Did you really think I'd let a $6 million watch disappear into a demolition site without saying something?" I kept my voice level, almost conversational. "Though I have to admit, I was curious to see how long it would take you to come here once you found out." Vivian sank into the room's only other chair, her legs apparently unable to support her anymore. "Daddy, I had no idea. If I'd known about the watch, about any of it, I never would have what I interrupted. Sold my workshop while I was unconscious. Thrown away 40 years of my life's work. Called me a disgrace and dumped me in this hellhole." She flinched at each accusation, but I wasn't finished. "Or are you saying you would have treated me differently if you'd known I had money?" "Is that what you're telling me, Vivienne?" "That's not what I meant," she said quickly, but we both knew it was exactly what she'd meant. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 68 years, and walked to the small dresser where I'd placed the velvet box. Her eyes widened as I opened it, revealing the Patek Philippe in all its rose-gold glory. "This watch," I said, holding it up to catch the afternoon light, "belonged to Elias Ashworth. He gave it to me 30 years ago because he said I understood value, real value. Not the kind that shows up on price tags, but the kind that lives in here." I tapped my chest, echoing his words from so long ago. "Daddy, please, he was wrong about me understanding value," I continued, ignoring her interruption. "Because if I'd really understood it, I would have realized years ago that my own daughter saw me as worthless." Vivian was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streams. "That's not true. I love you, Daddy. I've always loved you." "Love," I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you call it when you tell someone they're an embarrassment? When you sell their home while they're unconscious? When you throw away their life's work like garbage?" I was scared, she sobbed. "You had a stroke and I didn't know what to do. I thought I was helping. You thought you were finally getting rid of the poor father who didn't fit into your perfect world," I said, my voice growing colder. "Don't lie to me now, Vivienne. We're past that." She fell to her knees beside my chair, grabbing my hands with desperate strength. "Please, Daddy. I know I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But we can fix this. We can make it right." "How?" I asked, looking down at her with the same detached interest I might show a broken clock that wasn't worth repairing. "How exactly do you propose to fix this?" "The watch," she said eagerly. "It's still yours. The legal situation is complicated, but you're alive, so you have a claim. We can fight for it together. With that kind of money, you could have the best care, the finest nursing home." "Ah," I said softly. "There at Island, what? The real reason you're here. The watch, the money. You're not sorry about how you treated me, Vivienne. You're sorry you threw away $6 million. That's not true," but her voice lacked conviction. I gently pulled my hands free from her grip and returned the watch to its box. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," I said, my voice taking on the authority of a man who'd finally remembered his own worth. "Tomorrow morning I'm meeting with my lawyer to update my will." Her face went white. "Your will, the watch, and anything else I might possess will go to someone who values me for who I am, not what I have. Someone who calls me Grandpa because he wants to, not because he has to. Someone who sees worth in broken things and believes they can be made beautiful again." "You're talking about a stranger," Vivian whispered. "No," I replied. "I'm talking about family. Real family. The kind that chooses to love each other." She staggered to her feet, her face cycling through disbelief, anger, and desperation. "You can't do this. I'm your daughter, your blood, and what has that blood relationship given me?" Vivian, shame, embarrassment. "A room in the cheapest nursing home you could find while you bought yourself a vacation house with the money from selling my life. Daddy, please. You made your choice 3 weeks ago when you called me a disgrace, I said, standing and walking to the door. Now I'm making mine. I opened the door, indicating that our conversation was over. But Vivienne didn't move. What do you want? She asked, her voice breaking. Money, I'll give you everything I have. A better room, I'll move you to the finest facility in Boston. Just tell me what you want. I looked at my daughter, this beautiful, successful woman, who had everything she thought she wanted, and had just realized it wasn't enough, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not anger, not hurt, not even disappointment, pity. I said quietly, for you to understand what disgrace really feels like. The next morning, Vivienne would wake up to discover that her perfect world was about to become a very public nightmare. And unlike the gentle, forgiving father she'd always taken for granted, the man she'd created through her cruelty was going to make sure she learned that some lessons can only be taught through loss. Time, as I'd learned from 47 years of clockmaking, had a way of revealing everyone's true nature. And Vivienne's time was up. The next morning I put on my best suit, the one I'd worn to Vivienne's wedding, and took a taxi to the offices of Morrison Klein & Associates, the most prestigious law firm in Salem. I'd chosen them carefully. Not only were they known for their discretion and expertise in estate planning, but they also happened to represent several prominent families whose social circles overlapped with Vivienne's business network. Word would spread quickly and in exactly the way I wanted it to. Mr. Blackwood, said Margaret Morrison, the senior partner, as she reviewed the documents I'd brought, I have to say this is quite an unusual situation. Are you certain you want to proceed with such a comprehensive revision of your estate plans? Completely certain, I replied, watching her examine the authentication papers for the Patek Philippe, and I want the will reading to be public, as is my right under Massachusetts law. She raised an eyebrow. Public will readings are rare these days, Mr. Blackwood. Most families prefer privacy in these matters. My family forfeited their right to privacy when they decided to treat me like an embarrassment, I said calmly. I want witnesses. I want documentation, and I want it all done properly so there can be no legal challenges. 2 hours later, everything was arranged. The will reading would take place the following Friday at 10 in the morning with proper legal notice given to all parties. Vivienne would be required to attend, as would Ezekiel, whom I was officially designating as my primary beneficiary. But first I had one more stop to make. The Salem Gazette had been covering local news for over a century, and their society reporter, Helen Crawford, had built her career on knowing everyone's business before they knew it themselves. She was exactly the kind of person who would appreciate the delicious irony of my story. Mr. Blackwood, she said, settling into her chair with the eager expression of a journalist who'd just sensed a major scoop. When you called and said you had a story about family values and hidden treasures, I have to admit you piqued my curiosity. I told her everything. Not just about the watch and Vivienne's betrayal, but about Ezekiel, about the true meaning of family, about the difference between being poor and being worthless. She took notes furiously, occasionally stopping to ask for clarification or additional details. This is remarkable, she said when I finished. And you're comfortable with all of this being public, Mrs. Crawford, I replied. My daughter spent years being ashamed of me because I wasn't successful enough for her standards. Now she's about to learn what real shame feels like. The article ran 3 days before the will reading under the headline, Local Clockmaker's Hidden Fortune Exposes Family's True Values. It was everything I'd hoped for and more. A detailed account of Vivienne's treatment of me, the discovery of the watch, and my decision to leave my estate to the young man who saw value where others saw only junk. The story spread through Salem's social circles like wildfire. By Thursday evening, everyone who mattered in Vivienne's professional and social world knew that she'd thrown away $6 million and abandoned her father to the cheapest nursing home she could find. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, perfectly matching the mood I imagined Vivienne was in. I arrived at the law office early, accompanied by Ezekiel, who looked nervous but determined in the new suit I'd bought him for the occasion. Are you sure about this, Grandpa Gus? He asked quietly, as we waited in the conference room. I mean, she's still your daughter. Yes, she is, I agreed. And that's exactly why this needs to happen. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who need the hardest lessons. Vivienne arrived exactly at 10, accompanied by her own lawyer, a sharp-looking woman who clearly specialized in contesting wills. My daughter looked haggard, her usually perfect appearance showing the strain of the past week. She'd obviously read the newspaper article, and judging by the dark circles under her eyes, she hadn't been sleeping well. She glanced at Ezekiel with obvious confusion and what might have been jealousy. This young stranger was about to inherit what she considered rightfully hers. Margaret Morrison called the meeting to order with professional efficiency. We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Augustus Elias Blackwood, executed on the 15th of October 2023. The will itself was straightforward but devastating. The Patek Philippe watch, valued at $6.2 million, according to the most recent Sotheby's appraisal, would go to Ezekiel Thompson, whom I was also naming as my adopted son and primary heir. My personal effects, what remained of my tools and a modest savings account, would also go to him. To Vivian, I left exactly $1 and a handwritten letter. $1. Vivian's lawyer immediately objected. This is clearly the result of undue influence, Mrs. Patterson. Margaret Morrison interrupted smoothly. My client was thoroughly evaluated by 2 independent psychiatrists before executing this will. He is of completely sound mind and fully understands the implications of his decisions. Vivian said nothing during the reading, but I watched her face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of hollow despair. When Margaret handed her the sealed letter I'd written, her hands shook as she opened it. I knew what it said because I'd agonized over every word. Vivian, you taught me that family isn't about blood, it's about respect, love, and seeing value in each other. Ezekiel has been more of a son to me in 3 weeks than you've been a daughter in 3 years. The money you're losing today is nothing compared to what you lost when you called me a disgrace. I hope someday you understand the difference. Dad. She read it twice, then looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. Daddy, please. But I was already standing helping Ezekiel to his feet. The legal proceedings are complete, I said formally. Ezekiel, shall we go home? As we left the conference room, I heard Vivian's lawyer already talking about appeals and challenges, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The will was ironclad, the documentation complete, and the story was already public. By evening, the news had spread beyond Salem. The story of the clockmaker who'd hidden a fortune and the daughter who'd thrown it away was exactly the kind of moral tale that captured people's imagination. Vivian's company began losing clients almost immediately, who wanted to work with someone who'd abandoned her own father. Within 2 weeks, Blackwood Marketing Solutions was facing bankruptcy. Vivian had to sell her penthouse and her vacation home just to cover her debts. The woman who'd once been embarrassed by her father's modest lifestyle found herself working as a hostess at a chain restaurant, struggling to make rent on a studio apartment. But the most satisfying part wasn't her financial ruin. It was the knowledge that she finally understood what I'd been trying to teach her all along. Some things are worth more than money, and some mistakes cost more than you can ever afford to pay. The clockmaker's daughter had finally learned to tell time. 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of our new workshop, watching Ezekiel put the finishing touches on his first completely original timepiece. The space was everything my old workshop had never been, bright modern with proper ventilation and state-of-the-art equipment. But more importantly, it was filled with the sound I'd missed most, the gentle symphony of dozens of clocks ticking in perfect harmony, marking time for people who understood their value. Hand me that jeweler's loop, would you? Grandpa Ezekiel asked, not looking up from his delicate work. At 17 now, he'd grown taller and more confident, but he still approached each timepiece with the same reverence that had first caught my attention in the library. I passed him the magnifying tool and watched as he made microscopic adjustments to the escapement mechanism. His hands were steady, his focus absolute. In 6 months, he'd progressed further than most apprentices managed in 2 years. Beautiful work, I said, examining the movement. Your balance wheel adjustment is flawless. He beamed with pride. I learned from the best. The adoption had been finalized 3 months ago, making Ezekiel officially my son and heir. But the paperwork was just a formality. He'd been family from the moment he'd called me Grandpa in that library. We'd used a small portion of the Patek Philippe's value to establish Blackwood & Son fine timepieces, with the rest invested safely for Ezekiel's future. The workshop specialized in restoration of vintage pieces, and word had spread quickly through collector networks. We had a 6-month waiting list, and clients from as far away as Switzerland. But the real treasure wasn't the money or the success. It was the joy of sharing my knowledge with someone who truly appreciated it. Every day Ezekiel asked questions that pushed me to think deeper about my craft. Every evening we sat together planning new projects and discussing the philosophy behind our work. This was what I'd always dreamed of when Vivian was young. A successor who saw beauty in precision, who understood that fixing broken things was a kind of magic, who valued tradition while embracing innovation. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Ezekiel glanced up from his work as I answered. Blackwood and Son, this is Gus, Daddy. The voice was barely a whisper, cracked with exhaustion and something that might have been desperation. Daddy, it's me. I hadn't heard from Vivian in 4 months, not since she'd stopped leaving voicemails begging for forgiveness. I'd heard through Salem's gossip network that she'd lost her apartment and was living in a boarding house working double shifts just to survive. Hello, Vivian. She paused, and I could hear traffic in the background. She was probably calling from a payphone, unable to afford a cell phone anymore. I saw the article in the Globe about your new business, about Ezekiel. The Boston Globe had run a feature story about our workshop the previous month, focusing on the heartwarming tale of a master craftsman and his adopted son carrying on traditional skills in a digital age. The journalist had been particularly taken with Ezekiel's story, the orphaned teenager who'd found family through a shared love of horology. What about it? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He looks happy, she said quietly. In the picture. He looks the way I used to look when you taught me things. When I was little, I remembered those days, 5-year-old Vivian standing on a stool beside my workbench, her eyes wide with wonder as I showed her how gears meshed together to create motion. When had that wonder turned to embarrassment? When had my daughter decided that her father's passion was something to be ashamed of? Yes, I agreed. He's very happy. Daddy, her voice broke. I know I don't have the right to ask, but I'm drowning here. I lost everything. My business, my house, my friends. I can't even afford groceries most weeks. Ezekiel had stopped working and was watching me carefully, his expression concerned. He'd never met Vivian, but he knew the story. He knew what she'd done to me and what I'd done to her in return. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, she was still my daughter, and I took no pleasure in her suffering. Could you possibly lend me some money, just enough to get back on my feet? I swear I'll pay you back. No, I said gently but firmly. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. When she spoke again, her voice was hollow. I understand. I know what I did was unforgivable. I just thought. I hoped. Vivian, I interrupted, I'm not saying no to punish you. I'm saying no because giving you money wouldn't solve your real problem. What do you mean? I looked at Ezekiel, who was pretending to work, while obviously listening to every word. This young man who'd had every reason to be bitter and cynical, who'd been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to care for him, yet who'd chosen to see value in an old man's dreams. Your problem isn't money, I told my daughter. Your problem is that you still don't understand what makes life worth living. You're still measuring success by bank balances and social status. Until you learn to see value in things that can't be bought, you'll never be truly wealthy no matter how much money you have. But Daddy, I'm desperate. Then maybe it's time to learn what really matters, I said. Goodbye, Vivian. I hung up and stood quietly for a moment, feeling the weight of that final conversation. Ezekiel set down his tools and came over to me. That was hard, he said simply. Yes, it was. Do you think she'll ever understand? I considered the question seriously. I don't know. I hope so. But that's her journey to make now. Ezekiel nodded, then surprised me by wrapping his arms around me in a fierce hug. I'm sorry you lost your daughter, he said quietly, but I'm grateful I found my dad. As I held this remarkable young man, my son in every way that mattered, I realized that Vivian had been wrong about almost everything, but she'd been right about one thing: family was the most important thing in life. She'd just never understood that the best families aren't the ones you're born into. They're the ones you choose, and who choose you back. Outside our workshop, Salem was waking up to another beautiful morning. Inside, surrounded by the gentle ticking of timepieces and the warmth of genuine love, I finally understood what Mr. Ashworth had tried to teach me all those years ago. Some things are worth more than money. Some bonds are stronger than blood. And some families are built not on obligation, but on respect, love, and the simple recognition that we all deserve to be valued for who we are. The old clock on our wall chimed 9 times, marking another hour in our shared journey. And for the first time in years, I wasn't counting the minutes until something better came along. I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly the family I'd always needed. Time, as any clockmaker knows, has a way of revealing what really matters. And what mattered was right here in this moment, in this workshop, with this son who'd chosen to love me, not for what I could give him, but for who I was. Some families are born, others are chosen. And the chosen ones, I'd learned, are often the strongest of all. As I sit here in my workshop today, surrounded by the gentle symphony of ticking clocks and watching my son Ezekiel master his craft, I often reflect on the journey that brought us together. It wasn't the path I'd planned, but sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as its harshest lesson. The truth is, we all carry invisible timepieces within us. Not the kind that measure hours and minutes, but the kind that count moments of genuine connection, acts of authentic love, and instances when we choose to see value in what others dismiss as worthless. Vivienne spent years focused on the wrong kind of time, the kind measured in quarterly profits and social status, while missing the precious moments that actually mattered. I learned that real wealth isn't found in bank accounts or prestigious addresses. It's found in the eyes of someone who sees you as you truly are and chooses to love you anyway. It's in the hands of a young person eager to learn what you have to teach. It's in the quiet satisfaction of fixing something broken and making it beautiful again. Family, I discovered, isn't just about shared DNA. It's about shared values, mutual respect, and the willingness to invest in each other's dreams. The most profound relationships in our lives are often with people who choose to walk alongside us, not because they have to, but because they want to. If this story touches your heart, perhaps it's because you recognize something universal in it. The longing to be valued for who we are, not what we possess. The desire to leave a meaningful legacy. The hope that love and justice can triumph over greed and cruelty. Maybe you have a Vivienne in your life, someone who's forgotten your worth in their pursuit of worldly success. Or perhaps you're searching for your own Ezekiel, that person who will see treasure where others see only junk potential, where others see only problems. Remember this, it's never too late to choose your family wisely, to recognize real value when you see it, and to understand that the most important things in life can't be bought, sold, or inherited. They can only be earned through love, respect, and the courage to see beauty in unexpected places. Time reveals everything eventually. Make sure that when your story is told, it's one of connection rather than possession of love, rather than status of chosen bonds, rather than obligated ones. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their worth isn't measured by their bank account, but by the love they give and receive. Don't forget to follow for more stories that remind us what truly matters in this precious fleeting life we're all sharing. After all, we're all just clockmakers in the end, trying to make the most of the time we've been given and hoping someone will remember us not for what we accumulated, but for how we loved. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.